The case of John and Ann Bender is an enigma shrouded in mystery and controversy, which intrigues and divides opinions to this day. The couple, who were looking for a paradise-like life in Costa Rica, saw their dreams turn into a nightmare with the tragic death of John in his own home in the jungle. What happened on that fateful night? Suicide, accident, or murder? These are the main theories that attempt to explain John Bender's death. Anne, his wife, was initially accused of murder, but has always denied any involvement. John Bender was born in 1966 in the United States, and from the beginning, he was considered a very intelligent guy. Some sources claim that during high school, he was a genius in science and mathematics. After leaving school, John studied physics at the University of Pennsylvania, which is located in the city of Philadelphia and has around 25,000 students. In addition to being intelligent, John Bender was also very handsome, and his appearance allowed him to work as a model at that time. But it was in the financial market, there on the Philadelphia Stock Exchange, that he grew professionally. According to CBS, when John was about 30 years old, he was already managing a $500 million hedge fund. And with this work of his, John made a lot of money. We don't have an exact number, but it was in the hundreds of millions of dollars. He became very rich at that time. Even though John had this job and made a lot of money, he never felt like he belonged in that environment. John felt a little out of place in the financial world, and maybe he even felt a little out of place in the world. John and Ann Bender. In 1998, when John was about 30-something, he met a woman named Ann, who was the daughter of an international banker. They fell in love at first sight, and John proposed to her just 2 weeks after they met. They had a strong connection, possibly because they both struggled with mental health issues and understood each other. Ann was diagnosed with bipolar disorder, which is a disorder characterized by mood swings. The person alternates between periods of depression and periods of euphoria or mania. John also had bipolar disorder, and he also suffered from depression. He would go from very happy to very sad in a matter of minutes, and he preferred to deal with his problems alone. He hated doctors. John and Ann got married the following year, in 1999. To get away from society, and also because John and Ann loved animals, they decided to use their fortune to build a mansion for them to live close to nature. The place they chose to build this mansion was a 5,000-acre plot of land in the rainforest of Costa Rica, a country in Central America. Mansion in Boracay, they named this property Boracay, after a plant. In Boracay, they built several houses and small buildings on the land to make everything work, and the main house was their mansion called Bender Dome. CBS described Bender Dome as a bizarre combination of Disneyland, an art museum, and something you'd only see in a James Bond movie. The Boracay mansion was 4 stories tall, made of tons of shiny granite. It had about 400 custom-made stained glass lights to illuminate the place. And what's more, the mansion had no walls. The house faced directly into the rainforest. In other words, they had direct contact with nature. There, they were close to waterfalls, plants, exotic flowers, and animals. To them, Boracay was paradise. The Benders moved to this extravagant and idyllic place in 2001, and the construction of the mansion brought running water, electricity, and dozens of jobs to the area. But despite this, the Benders received a cold reception from the locals. In April 2001, for example, Ann and John were driving through the area until armed men in an unmarked car forced them to pull over to the side of the road. These armed men said they were police officers, but they were not wearing any identification, not even uniforms. Ann thought it was a kidnapping. One of these armed men pulled John out of the car, and when John went to protest and say something to the men, one of them shot John between the legs and then pointed the gun at his head. It was a scary moment for the family. In the end, the armed men were actually Costa Rican police officers. They just wanted to deliver some documents that had arrived from the United States to John, related to a legal case. But before finding out, John was detained for 6 hours without knowing what was happening. This incident was a trauma for John, who began to live in fear. A few months after this incident, there was another attempted break-in at the house in Boracay, but it was unsuccessful. Because of these events, the couple bought several weapons, hired guards, and turned the mansion into a fortress, all to feel safe. At that time, it was quite common for John to carry a gun around the property. In 2005, the Benders created a $70 million fund to manage Boracay, and John appointed lawyer Juan de Dios Alvarez, who was a trusted man of his, to manage these funds. And around that time, Juan convinced the Benders to invest in precious jewelry. According to Juan, jewelry would be a good investment because it was easy to move and would not lose value easily. And the Benders accepted this suggestion. Around that time, the Bender mansion became full of jewelry. They had $20 million in precious jewelry scattered around the mansion, stored in bags, backpacks, and suitcases. And these jewelry had no documentation. Jewelry collection. According to some sources, John and Anne really liked shiny things. Collecting jewelry became almost a hobby, so they liked having the precious stones right there in the house. It was a bit extravagant, but it suited them. Around that time, the couple's depression got much worse. Anne said that in the fall of 2009, she had even stopped eating. She consulted a psychiatrist and then started taking several antidepressant medications. John, in turn, also went to the psychiatrist, but refused to take antidepressants. According to Anne, during this period, John became suicidal. He wanted to die and had even tried to do so before, without success. There are not many details about what happened, but some sources claim that John had already tried to jump from a very high place. John's death on January 8, 2010, during the early hours of the morning. Oswaldo, one of the guards who worked there, heard a loud noise coming from John and Anne's room. It was the sound of a gunshot. Soon after the noise, Anne contacted Oswaldo by radio, crying and desperate, asking for help. Oswaldo went up in the elevator, worried, opened the door, and found the following scene. He saw Anne kneeling at the foot of the bed. She had blood splattered on her face and was holding John's hands, who was lying on the bed, dead. The bed was covered in blood splatter. John was 44 years old. Anne was in shock. All she could say was, "I tried to stop him, but I couldn't." Oswaldo also noticed that on the floor near the bed, one of John's weapons was lying. It was a Ruger 9mm semi-automatic handgun, and Oswaldo found this a little strange. John carrying a gun was quite common after those incidents with the police, but John never kept his guns with him at night. He locked them up at bedtime, but that kind of went unnoticed in the confusion. Oswaldo called the authorities. Meanwhile, Anne took a tranquilizer to calm down, and then started calling and sending emails to her family to let them know what had happened. Anne told one family member that John had finally done what he wanted to do. Then the police soon arrived, and there were a lot of them. The mansion was in chaos, people. According to some sources, several police officers weren't there to work. It seemed like they wanted to see what the inside of the mansion was like. A lot of people went to see it, and they weren't treating the house as a possible crime scene, which may have hindered the collection of evidence. But of course there were police officers working seriously. They took Anne's statement. Anne's version to the police. According to Anne, she woke up in the middle of the night and saw John sitting on the bed, pointing a gun at his head. Anne got a jolt of adrenaline, of course, and tried to jump towards him to take the gun from John's hand. In the confusion, the gun slipped from his hand, fell, and then went off on its own. Anne claims that she did not hold the gun directly. The shot hit the back of John's head. In other words, The version that Anne told indicated that John wanted to commit suicide and that Anne tried to stop him. But the police began to suspect the situation. They did not buy this version. So Anne was taken to the police station and was questioned. The police confiscated her clothes, which could serve as possible evidence, and also confiscated the couple's computers. On them, the police found some messages written by John a week before he died. One of these messages said, "I want to be dead. I feel so horrible. I want to kill everyone and then kill myself." A few hours after John's death, Anne called her psychiatrist, Dr. Lizano, asking for help. She wanted to be admitted to a hospital because, in addition to being in a state of shock from what had just happened, she had also been very ill for some time. In addition to her mental health problems, Anne also had several sores on her body, which some sources claim were probably caused by Lyme disease, a bacterial infection spread by the bite of infected ticks. This disease leaves a person very debilitated. Some symptoms include weakness, numbness in the limbs, fever, chills, fatigue, body aches, impaired muscle movement, among others. Apparently, John was treating his wife for this disease, but in an unscientific and ineffective way. He was treating her with dirty river water. After John's death, Anne was hospitalized for 7 months. At that time, she weighed only 38 kilos, and according to the doctor, she had been so weak for so long that she could not lift a fork. And even though the circumstances indicated that John's death was a suicide, and Dr. Lozano stated that Anne was so weak that she would not have been able to lift a gun, Anne was the investigators' #1 suspect. Suspicions about Anne. The police began to suspect that she had murdered her husband and began to build a case against her. They initially accused her of smuggling. When John died, he had several pieces of jewelry scattered around the Bender dome. There were approximately 3,000 precious stones, diamonds, opals, rubies, and several others, which were worth around $20 million. Because of this, the police suspected that Anne and John were part of some smuggling scheme. For them, Anne may have killed her husband to get the jewelry. The police then accused her of buying these jewelry illegally on the black market, importing several blood diamonds, which are diamonds extracted from war zones in Africa, laundering money and selling these jewelry at parties for millionaires that theoretically took place under the covers there in the mansion. Anne said that the jewelry was a hobby and also a form of investment. She denied the accusations and said that these parties never happened, but she was arrested anyway. In addition to the jewelry argument, the police also found inconsistencies at the scene of the possible crime. One point would be the bullet hole. According to the investigators, someone with suicidal tendencies would probably aim for the mouth, the temple, or under the chin. But the shot that killed John entered through the back of his head, a placement that is not very common in a suicide situation. Things get even stranger if we consider the path the bullet took. It went through John's head, entering under his right ear and continuing behind his left eye. In other words, the shot came from the right side. But John was left-handed. It was strange that he would use his left hand to shoot himself behind the head on the right side. In addition, a pillow that had been found near John's head had a tear with gunpowder, indicating that it may have been placed on top of John's head at the time of the shot. John was also still using earplugs, which are those ear protectors that prevent people from hearing noise when they sleep. So it was as if when John died, he was going to sleep. It wasn't as if he was going to end his own life. And finally, John still didn't have gunpowder residue on his hand, which makes sense with Anne's version that the gun had fallen from his hand and then fired on its own. But this is also something that can be viewed with suspicion, as if John had been shot from afar by an assassin. Anne's first trial in August 2011, after leaving the hospital and about 19 months after John died, Anne was officially charged with murder. Thus began years of struggle to understand what really happened that early morning in January 2010 when John died. If Anne was telling the truth and was innocent, or if John had been murdered. In 2011, her trial began. Anne maintained the version of events that I told you earlier, that she woke up in the early hours of the morning, saw John with the gun in his hand, tried to stop him, but the gun fell and ended up going off anyway. On the other side, there were people accusing her of murder. I have also told you some points about the accusation here. For Anne, this was a very difficult time in her life, especially since she was still sick. She had been released from the hospital, but she was still not 100% healthy. And to make matters worse, while all this was happening, Juan was the one who was taking care of the Benders' funds. But Anne regretted trusting him. In July 2012, while Anne was still in custody, she sued Juan for fraud. The lawsuit alleged that Juan was using the Benders' money as a personal piggy bank, buying horses for his farm and paying off his personal credit cards. The authorities raided Juan's office and seized 135 boxes of documents, and Juan stopped managing the Benders' money. Because this happened in the middle of the legal proceedings, some people accused Anne of using this fact to distract from her case. But ultimately, in January 2013, a 3-judge panel acquitted Anne Bender. They said it had not been proven that Anne killed John. Despite all this, it was also not proven in court that John had committed suicide. After being acquitted, Anne Bender hoped for a new beginning. She moved to a small apartment, still in Costa Rica. And she started dating another American, a guy named Greg Fisher, and everything seemed to be improving. Until in May 2014, she was put on trial again for John's murder, for the second time. The thing is, Costa Rica has a particularity. Anyone involved in the process can appeal a court decision as many times as they want. In other words, there was a court decision there. If someone does not agree with the judge's decision, that person can, by law, appeal and have the trial rerun. And in this new trial, it is possible to use the same evidence, the same witnesses, the same accusations, basically to have the same trial all over again, but now expecting a different result. And that's what happened. In Anne's new trial, there were new judges, but the defense was more or less the same, and the prosecutors also repeated more or less the same accusation, using as arguments the evidence from the body, the bullet wound, the bloodstains. For them, everything pointed to murder. Anne Bender's second trial. The trial lasted about a week, and on May 27, 2014, Anne was found guilty. She was sentenced to 22 years in prison. Her boyfriend, Greg, was devastated. So were her family and lawyers. From inside the prison, Anne tried to overturn the conviction, appealing the sentence. While this was happening, her new boyfriend, Greg Fisher, ended up dying of an asthma attack. He died in his own bed during the night. After 9 months in prison, in the winter of 2015, Anne won the appeal, and the court overturned the verdict. In other words, the courts overturned the conclusion they had reached that Anne had murdered John. The third trial, in 2015, a third trial took place, and this time, Anne was found not guilty. As soon as the Costa Rican authorities returned her passport, Anne boarded a plane and flew straight to the United States. Anne moved to a new home, this time on the east coast of the United States in Florida. She put the Boracay property up for sale and managed to recover the jewelry, which had been seized by the courts. Then, a Costa Rican court said it intended to try Anne Bender a fourth time. In 2020, when Costa Rica issued a new arrest warrant against Anne, the United States did not extradite her, so she remains in the United States, apparently free from further legal proceedings in Costa Rica. To this day, the case of John and Anne Bender remains shrouded in controversy. Anne returned to the United States after her acquittal, but questions about what really happened that night in Boracay remain unanswered. The case is a reminder of how complex and ambiguous human tragedies can be, especially when there are no witnesses and a husband, wife, and money are involved.